Well, why don't you tell us about yourself? Introduce yourself, Nick.
So my name's Nick Taylor. I am a paraplegic as a result of a motor vehicle accident. My level of injury is T10, and I grew up in South Africa, so I immigrated to Australia post-injury.
All right, so how old were you when you had your injury then?
I was 18 years old when I had my injury, so been driving my car for less than 3 months. And as you do when you're 18 years old, I thought I was bulletproof or invincible and drove my car too fast and had a bit of a shitbox of a first car that wasn't very reliable, and happened to have 4 other people in the car on the day that I had my injury, and that made the car handle very differently from just me thrashing it around, and went over a bump in the road a little bit faster than I should have and lost control of the car.
How about the others? Were the others injured?
My girlfriend at the time on the passenger seat was broke her back, but didn't sever her spinal cord, thankfully. So that meant she ended up making a full recovery, which I'm thankful for small mercies in life, because I'm not sure as the driver of the vehicle how I would have coped if she had been a paraplegic and I had walked away or recovered from my injury. So I guess in terms of small mercies, that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, there's something different about causing your own injury and causing someone else's, isn't
there?
Yeah,
absolutely.
You don't have to deal with guilt in the same way.
I think there was still a fair bit of guilt, but guilt that I could get past. I mean, there was a fair bit of trauma in rolling your car up against a tree, and I remember us being trapped in the vehicle. I kind of regained consciousness to feel this really warm feeling against the side of my face, and wasn't quite sure what it was, and ultimately realized that it was my own leg, it was my calf muscle. I had somehow snapped the steering wheel and ended up with my head down by the pedals of the car and was leaning against my own leg, and my leg felt warm against my face, and it was kind of at that point when I knew that something was drastically wrong and that things weren't going to be the same again.
It's a visceral story. Of you even telling it now, does it bring back that sense of trauma, or is it become a bit blasé this far down the track?
Yeah, it's 22 years ago now, so it's I guess I've come to terms with it. As you say, it was my own doing, and there's no one else I can blame for the accident. So I suppose probably makes it a lot easier to come to terms with it. Made my own decisions, and
you've told that story so many times, so it's not quite as traumatic now.
Yeah, look, I've certainly I'm open with sharing my story, so I have told it a few times.
Yeah. What sort of person were you before the injury? If you were to think about, what you lived for, your sense of meaning and purpose, what life was about before the injury.
I come from a really sporty family, and my older brother represented our province at rugby union, and my sister represented South Africa for tennis and went on a scholarship to the States. And I wasn't going to play rugby or tennis, obviously, because I wasn't going to live up to that standard. But I found basketball and discovered that was my sort of passion as a youngster. And from about 11 years old through to when I had my injury at 18 years old, I was pretty much obsessed with the game of basketball. In fact, when I had my accident, it was at our national championships. I'd driven to another province, and I was representing Natal, my province, as the captain of my 18 and under national team, provincial team at national championships, and that's when I had my injury. So my life pre-accident was pretty much dominated by basketball and sport. I surfed a lot and played basketball. Those were kind of the two sports that kept me going and gave me a lot of direction as a youngster trying to get through school.
So you have an injury, and all of a sudden you can't play basketball. When looking back, what was the loss and the grief that you dealt with, and what were the key dimensions of that?
Yeah, the basketball was a big part of it, but as an 18-year-old, not having experienced a lot of life yet, I think the biggest things for me in terms of loss was this realization that, well, it seemed like a realization at the time. In hindsight, it's incorrect, but this assumption that I was never going to find someone who was going to love me, I was never going to be able to have a family or raise kids, or all these things that you take for granted growing up, that one day I'll experience that phase in life and I'll be able to do all those things. Like, I was lying in hospital thinking, well, that's all been taken away from me, and I won't get the opportunity to meet someone that will fall in love with me and get married and have a family and have kids and all those things. And I guess not having ever met somebody with a disability or knowing anybody else in a wheelchair, I had no idea what was possible when I had my injury. And my automatic assumptions were that all of that was ripped away from me and I wouldn't be able to do any of those things.
Life felt like it was over.
Yeah, and one of those things was basketball. I was sitting out a few months. The school year ended in December in South Africa, and the American college school year starts in August. And this was kind of during that time period that I was waiting to go and take up a scholarship to play basketball in the States when I had my accident. I kind of felt like all of that was ripped out from underneath me as well, and that I wasn't going to be able to pursue all those dreams and aspirations that I had around competing, and potentially representing South Africa at a senior level. I'd managed to represent South Africa, through the age divisions growing up playing basketball, but my ambition was always to represent South Africa at a senior level and go and, take up a basketball scholarship and see where that would get me.
Yep.
Obviously, it felt like all of that was just completely ripped out from underneath me and I would never be able to pursue those things. So there were some pretty dark days early on.
How did you cope with that at the time? Do you remember?
Look, it took me a while to come to terms with that stuff, and people tried to draw me to wheelchair basketball straight away, and that just didn't feel like basketball to me. Like I looked at that and sort of, that's not the basketball I've grown up playing. And in hindsight, I'm very thankful that I had these wheelchair basketball players turn up to my rehab unit to come. There were some articles in the paper about me being a decent up-and-coming basketball player and having had an injury.
They wanted you on the team.
These guys were the ambulance chasers that were, we joked about them being ambulance chasers, but they were there at the rehab unit saying, we need this guy on our team. Like, he knows how to play basketball. All he needs to do is learn how to push a wheelchair and we'll have a valuable asset in the team. And I pushed back on that because I wasn't that interested in playing wheelchair basketball initially, just because I felt like it wasn't the same. But what I realized in hindsight is having those guys turn up to the rehab unit and, seeing them get out of their cars and have stunning girlfriends and all these insecurities I was having about what I was going to be able to do with my life. And then to have somebody, turn up driving a sports car and have his hot blonde girlfriend get out the other side with him and come and visit me in rehab made me think, wow, maybe some of these things are still possible.
Oh, that's great. Any other mechanisms for coping with the grief at the time?
I think just the family support and I've got a pretty close-knit family with 3 siblings, and just having that support around me and a really strong network, not only family, but also through the basketball community. That, the sports teams that you're a part of almost feel like a family when you've traveled on the road and toured together and done those sort of things. And having those support mechanisms in place was, I think, what helped me get through those darker days. If I think about my life prior to injury, I didn't have much of a relationship with my dad. My family was a little bit dysfunctional and just wasn't important to me to have a relationship with my dad before I had my injury. But once I had my injury, my dad kind of really stepped up and helped me get through that as well. My mum as well, obviously. But I guess in coming back to your question about what happened after that, I sat down with my dad and said, well, what career should I be pursuing, or what should I be studying? What can I actually do now that I'm in a wheelchair? Like, surely my options are limited, so let's pick something that I can actually still do in a wheelchair. And I went and did a business science degree at the University of Cape Town, and spent 5 years doing a 4-year degree and had a lot of fun doing it, but probably grew up a lot in those years as well, and kind of realized that those assumptions that I made about what was possible when I was lying in hospital contemplating being injured were actually completely incorrect. And I ended up getting a wheelchair basketball scholarship and living in Texas for a year and, playing basketball on a scholarship like I had dreamed of doing as a kid, but this was wheelchair basketball. And I just kind of modified those dreams and aspirations a bit and managed to keep setting goals for myself and pursuing those.
How did you make that transition then? You didn't want to play this pathetic disabled sport. What was it that changed in your head?
Yeah, funny story actually. I went to university in Cape Town, as far away from home as I could get, because I was determined to prove that I could be independent. And I was waiting for my luggage at the carousel at the airport, and the local wheelchair basketball team happened to be getting off another flight and had seen me in the arrivals hall and started giving me a hard time about playing sport and why don't you play sport, and not having any idea of my background or the fact that I actually used to be a relatively good sports person. And these guys just were laying into me about, are you one of those useless cripples that just stays at home and never does anything? And, they were really giving it to me. Yeah, as people with disabilities can be towards other people with disabilities, they were very harsh. But eventually I caved and said, I'll come and watch one of your wheelchair basketball games. So basically just, to kind of get them off my back, I said, yeah, I'll come and watch and see what one of your games are like. And I got there and watched the game and kind of enjoyed watching the game. And as it turned out, the national coach happened to be at the game, watching the game, and I picked up a ball afterwards and started shooting the basketball and realized that the mechanics of shooting weren't very different at all, whether you were sitting down or standing up, and managed to still be able to shoot sitting down. And the coach saw me and kind of, was really interested in me and my background and where I'd come from and how I was able to still, shoot the basketball so well sitting down. And he kind of got me involved. Happened to be an Australian coach that was coaching the South African team at the time, and got me involved. And kind of once I got involved again, I realized how much I missed that camaraderie of team sport and the competitiveness, and just having a competitive outlet again changed my sort of outlook. And I got so much out of the relationships that I had from being involved in sport.
It's intriguing, isn't it? It's not just the sport, it's all of the social side that goes with that.
Absolutely.
The challenging yourself.
I was still struggling with all of these day-to-day things like daily ablutions and catheters and managing a dysfunctional bladder and bowel, and being able to chat to somebody else in the basketball team who had similar challenges but had overcome those or was a few more years down the track was absolutely invaluable to me. Didn't realize at the time that I was getting that out of sport, but in hindsight, that's the stuff that helped me get through.
You, this is not directly relevant to what we're talking about, but you and I sitting in Australia. So how on earth did you get from South Africa to Texas to Australia? Why are you here now?
Yes, when I finished my degree, I went back to Cape Town and finished my degree in Cape Town. And just so happened that I managed to get a good job coming out of university, but the caveat with that job was that I had to move to Johannesburg. And having grown up on the coast in Durban and surfing regularly as a youngster growing up, and then going to beautiful Cape Town for university and spending a bit of time in the States in between, I really didn't enjoy Johannesburg at all, and just disliked my time in Joburg altogether, and ended up coming out to Sydney on a holiday and eventually coming to play wheelchair basketball as an import player for the Wollongong Rollerhawks, and got to see a bit of Australia that way, because the team plays in a national league competition where you travel on the weekends to all the different states to play against their state-based teams, and just loved Australia. Just really enjoyed the opportunities that it held, and the similar culture to South Africa and growing up, but obviously a lot more politically stable, and felt like a place where I'd like to raise my kids one day.
Life takes you surprising places. You talked before about you thought when you had your injury that you wouldn't be able to do all these things, and now you've said you raise your kids. So you managed to get married and have kids. How did you do that? You've got a spinal cord injury, Nick. You can't do those things.
That's what I thought. But I suppose once you learn how to take care of yourself again and be independent and regain that dignity that you lose going through the rehabilitation process, I started to build some self-confidence. And when I immigrated over here to Australia, I met my wife through sport, through basketball. I was asked to fill in as an import player with a team that was traveling to Japan, and my wife happened to be managing that basketball team. So we met, on the plane traveling over to Japan, and got to know each other on this trip in Japan. And that's how I met my wife. And now we've got two beautiful young boys, 6 and 7 years old, Mitchell and Bailey. And I feel like life's pretty complete at the moment, and all those things that I thought that I couldn't have when I was lying in hospital, I've managed to get to that point anyway. So
if only you could tell yourself in that hospital day, hey, it'll be all right.
Yeah, and I guess I look at that and think, well, I have the opportunity to help other people to realize that now.
What do you think are the positive changes or personal growth that you've experienced in life since your injury or because of your injury?
I think having my injury really forced me to grow up pretty quickly in terms of being a bit more of a reflective person and working out what's important to me in life. As an 18-year-old, all I was doing was playing sport and kind of just competing and doing as best as I could, but not really thinking about the future too much and where things were going and what I was going to do with my life. Yet when I had my injury, it was like having a early onset midlife crisis. I had to work out what I was going to do now, and all these constraints were in place and the world wasn't my oyster anymore. So I really had to think hard and work hard to figure out what the future held for me. So I think if I think of positive things that came from that, I had to mature pretty quickly and really figure out who I was as a person and what I wanted to do with my life.
Well, then who are you as a person and what have you done with your life and do you want to do with your life?
Look, I think if I think about who I am now or what I enjoy as a person now, the things that are important to me are my family. I still enjoy participating in sport and being competitive, really enjoy meeting new people and getting to know different people's stories and just being able to have a positive influence over other people's lives is something that I take a lot of pride in and get a lot of satisfaction out of. So yeah, I think if I had to describe myself, I would say interested in sport, lots of different kinds of sport, very passionate about my family and providing for my family and giving my kids the best opportunities I can.
How is because you've talked about sport, what about your career? Has your work been meaningful for you? Has that just been something you've done to earn a salary and that's enough meaning out of it? How does your vocation fit in with that?
Yeah, look, I've had a bit of a moment of reflection in my professional career as well. I took a job with Westpac Bank when I first came out to Australia, and that was a means to an end. It was a good, well-paid job that allowed me to pursue my sporting ambitions at the same time. A lot of benefits to working for a big organisation like Westpac, and things like sporting leave and the ability to travel overseas and still have your job held for you and come back to it. But I guess after 10 years of working at the bank, I realised that returning shareholder value wasn't that important to me, and I needed to try and figure out what I could do that was going to leave the world in a better place or feel a bit more meaningful to me in terms of making a contribution to the world. And I took what they call a career break from Westpac and went and ran the Sargood Foundation while Sargood on Collaroy, the resort for people with spinal cord injuries, was being developed. And that really opened my eyes to a different world that, was more interested in social outcomes and helping people than making money for the bank. So I wasn't able to go back to the bank after my year's career break. It just didn't feel like I was ever going to be able to go back to the bank. So then I found a role at iCare that sort of felt like somewhere in between a not-for-profit that was actually helping people overcome adversity, similar to myself, that have had injuries on New South Wales roads. But that still paid a reasonable salary and allowed me to provide for my family. And
the best of both worlds. Not too bad of money and meaningful work. So
yeah, some days it's the best of both worlds.
And look, you've taken 20 years to get there, so you don't always arrive at these things straight away. You've had to struggle for it. So congratulations. Thinking of your injury and development, what do you think? Did the injury have a negative impact on your sense of meaning and purpose in life, or not really?
Oh, initially, for sure. Initially, I didn't feel like there was much point to carrying on because I couldn't do all the things that I'd planned to do, and had all these great kind of ideas of playing elite sport and traveling the world and doing these things that were important to me as an 18-year-old, and felt like I couldn't do any of those things. So yeah, it absolutely pulled the rug out from underneath me, and I felt like there was no point in carrying on. I certainly had some really dark days where I was kind of reflecting on, what is the point? What am I doing? But I think that's all part of the journey, and sometimes people need to go through that in order to come out the other side and be positive, easygoing, laid back people.
You and I have talked before actually about that whole thinking about meaning and purpose. And like early on as a young 18-year-old, it's not actually something you even stop and think about anyway, has it? So whereas the spinal cord injury and aging gets you thinking on these areas more, when you look at your own life and the sort of person you've become, what is it about your life that you sort of think, I'm really proud of this part of my life, not only this thing that I've done, but this part of who I've become, my strengths, and, what have you discovered about yourself that maybe would surprise the 18-year-old you? What are you proud of? What are your strengths? What have you brought to your own success in life?
Look, I think being able to overcome that adversity that I was faced with is something that I'm proud of. It's kind of second nature now because this is the new normal and this is what my life looks like. But every now and then...
Every day has some adversity.
Yes, every now and then you have one of those bad days where you sort of think, life's so much harder than it needs to be or it should be. And then you realize that you're actually doing okay in overcoming, some adversity that a lot of other people don't need to deal with. And being a relatively normal, stable human being in spite of the challenges that I've faced. And I think some of the things that I'm proud of is probably more the person that I am now than the achievements that I've managed to, have since my injury. It's more about being a good person and being able to appreciate other people and being a good father and being a part of a family and being able to provide for that family are things that I'm proud of. And I feel like our achievements, even though it's a much different sense of achievement from what I thought of as an 18-year-old.
The Olympic champion is not as important.
It's not about being a professional sports person.
What have you, what in terms of your own self-development have you really had to work on over the years? What were your weaknesses, or is there still some that you're working on?
Plenty of weaknesses. I think if I reflect on my sort of attitude and how it's changed over time, I found it really difficult to ask for help from anybody. I was on this kind of mission once I'd got past those early dark days to prove how independent that I could be. And that meant doing absolutely everything for myself. And I suppose I'm in a fortunate position that I was able to go through that journey and I could do absolutely everything for myself. But in the end, you kind of realize that that's not really what's important. And when, being able to ask somebody for help is a skill that I had to develop, or I had to get comfortable with that situation because it just made me completely uncomfortable at first. And it's still something that I struggle with, to be honest. If I can't reach something in the kitchen and I have to ask my wife to get it down, it annoys me.
Yeah, we're so proud, aren't we? But you're right. It's a skill to ask because you don't want to annoy them, and so it's fascinating.
That's certainly something that I'm working on still now. I feel like I'm still not particularly good at that. Yeah,
our culture doesn't raise men up to be very good at independence and asking for help, does it? You've talked about friendships in the sporting realm. Have you got any that stand out to you in terms of your relationships and friendships, and what was it about those friendships? How did you get them? Because, you've travelled a bit, you've been international, and sometimes spinal cord injury can be lonely. So how have you found those friends, and what was it about the meaningful ones that helped you get through?
I think the friends that I had prior to my injury, I had school friends or lifelong friends that I've still got some of those friendships, but a lot of them just fell by the wayside because we didn't have the common interest anymore. Most of those friendships came through sport, and the fact that I wasn't playing able-bodied basketball anymore just meant we didn't have that common ground. So I think just naturally those friendships kind of fell away. But then I made so many new friendships through wheelchair basketball and the other sort of sporting pursuits that I've taken on post-injury. And they've been incredible friendships, and there's so much in common as a result of sharing a spinal cord injury. That's meant that those are really rich and valuable friendships that I'll hold on to forever, I have no doubt.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've not myself connected with some of those sporty connections after, and hearing about it makes me wonder whether I've really missed out.
At the time, I didn't realize the value of all those relationships that came through sport.
Yeah.
And I think only now, having retired from international wheelchair basketball and representing Australia, I can look back at it and think, well, that wasn't actually the important part. The important part was all those people that I met along the way, and all those friendships and relationships and those shared experiences of traveling different parts of the world where they didn't speak English and we had to work out, how to navigate different cities and figuring out different challenges while you're overseas together. Those friendships and those experiences are, money can't buy that stuff.
So given that there'll be people listening to this story who are not sporty and don't have those opportunities, and now that you've retired from sports, how are you making those friendships now, and where are you finding those connections now in this different stage of life?
Look, I still play sport. It's not at the elite level anymore, but I do it now because I enjoy the friendships and the relationships and the camaraderie. So I still play wheelchair basketball. Happy to be on the bench or help coaching the team or whatever it is, but I'm still involved in some way because I've recognized how important those relationships are to me. I've discovered golf as a sport. My post sort of international wheelchair basketball sport has been golf, and that's become a recent passion of mine, and that's something that's really allowed me to connect with different people. I love that as a member of my local golf club, I can play with somebody who drives a garbage truck or somebody who has a multi-million-dollar company, and get to spend 4 hours going around a golf course with that person and chatting to them and getting to know these different people. I find that fascinating, and I've met some interesting people that way, and I really enjoy that it's broadened my horizons a bit, and that it's not just other guys in chairs playing wheelchair sports that I interact with now. It's kind of, I feel much more a part of a wider community now.
Yeah. I'll narrow it down before I get off the friendships thing to your relationship with your wife. Just because you didn't think that was going to be possible. How did you get the girl, and how have you maintained that relationship and navigated in a marriage the challenges of, bloody catheters or, all of this sort of nonsense that really affects a marriage relationship? How have you been a husband, and how's your wife navigated that difficult sort of space?
Look, I think I was very fortunate in that my wife had spent a bit of time around people with disabilities. She was managing the Australian women's wheelchair basketball team when I met her. So she'd had some exposure already, which meant there wasn't as much awkwardness initially as there was, for example, when I was in university and, met my first girlfriend post-injury. There were so many awkward moments and kind of awkward times around catheters and bladder and bowel dysfunction that were just embarrassing things that made you want to crawl into a hole.
It takes a lot of courage. It's interesting
certainly does.
To say I'm going to enter into this relationship in those situations.
Yeah.
Despite the sort of challenges. And
I think the biggest struggles I've had with coming to terms with my injury have been in those days when relationships are so important, but something goes wrong, like bladder and bowel or sexual dysfunction kind of issues that have really dragged me back down again and made me experience those lows again, when you sort of realize that this is not going to change and it's permanent, and you're going to have to find a way to cope with the way it is because it's not getting any better. That really hit home to me when I started dating and when I started pursuing relationships. And I guess if I come back to your question about my wife, she'd already had some exposure, so I was very fortunate that I didn't have to explain a lot of things. She knew a lot about people with disabilities already, which was great. It made it so much easier for me. But it's still a challenge, if I'm honest. To this day, it's being married is a challenging thing in itself. But throw in the disability and the awkwardness around dysfunctional bladders and bowels and sexual function, and it's absolutely still a challenge.
And you just go on because you've got no choice.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm fortunate to have a beautiful wife and two beautiful young boys and a family, and I'm thankful for what I do have, as opposed to focusing on the things that I can't do, or that are missing, because there's so much more that's good in the relationship and in our family that's worth focusing on.
So we're getting near the end, and there's some other questions that I think we've already answered around the way, so I won't repeat them. But if you had your life again, we've been asking all of our participants this, so we'll ask you, if you've had life again and you had this time machine and you could go back and you could maybe tell the person who's about to start that car, drive a little slower this time, hit this bump a bit slower, would you jump in that time machine and change the past?
My initial reaction to that is hell yes. This life of disability as a paraplegic is not an easy one, and there's no escaping it. Having to empty your bladder with a catheter every 3 or 4 hours, you don't get to forget that you have a disability. It's bloody hard. So if I could change it, yeah, I would change it. I don't love being in a wheelchair. I don't love dealing with the challenges of dysfunctional body parts.
Yep. But what would you have lost?
Yeah, the reason I said that's my initial reaction is because when I do stop and reflect on that, I think there's no way I would have experienced the things that I've experienced in my life had I not had my injury. Yeah, life would have taken a different path, and who knows where that might have led. But I've led a pretty full and rewarding life in spite of my injury. I've met my wife. I started the family that I didn't think I could have. I've got 2 beautiful young sons. I can't imagine what life would be like without my boys. Yeah, I suppose if I hadn't had my injury, I would never have immigrated to Australia. I would never have met my wife. I wouldn't have the family that I have. So it's hard to know what life might have looked like if I hadn't had my injury. So I guess if you forced me to choose between changing my life and not having the injury and giving up the family and the amazing experiences that I've had now, yeah, then I'd probably change my answer and say, I don't want to give up the amazing experiences and the family and the things that I've managed to experience in life. Like, they've been pretty awesome, and it's been a life worth living.
I almost want to end there, but we are talking to a bunch of people who are going through that difficult transition time, who are finding life hard. So you've got a completely open slate. What would you say to that group of people? Maybe what tips? What's your sort of last words you'd give to them?
I think the realization that I have in hindsight now is that the things that were really important to me when I had my injury aren't as big a deal as you think at the time. You can still have a full life. You can still achieve in a professional career or sport or have a family. All of those things are still possible. And those things that seem like such a big deal, or, the real showstoppers at the time when you're dealing with those down days or those really difficult times, you get past those, and those aren't as big a deal further down the track. So if you can just keep pushing through for long enough to get past some of those initial hurdles, there's so much more to live for. And yeah, you can have a really full and rewarding life in spite of being somewhat different and having a disability.